Welcome everyone to a new episode of Talking About Books for Kids. I know it's been a minute since I've recorded an episode or shared an episode, but thank you so much for your patience. But I'm excited for this particular episode because one, I get back to talking about what I love, what one of the things I love the most, reading books and talking about books for children. And this particular episode, we have our special guest, Dr. Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, who is the author of the newly released book, The Dark Fantastic: Race and the Imagination from Harry Potter to the Hunger Games. So this is also a special episode for me as well because it'll be featured as well on my other podcast, which is taken up some of my time and why I haven't been putting out as many episodes of talking about books for kids. So, and that podcast is What is Black. So I'll put a little commercial for that podcast where I talk about parenting Black children and helping parents, as we talk about issues of race, identity, culture, and, kind of questioning and challenging generalizations and stereotypes of what it means to be Black in America. And I think this is a great book. I think books do a wonderful job of helping us as parents to teach our kids and to learn about ourselves and reflect on our culture and who we are. And I think I think you'll really enjoy this conversation with Dr. Elizabeth Thomas. So I'll stop talking and we'll get started with the episode.
So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Thomas. So I have a special guest today with me, Dr. Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, and she is the author of the forthcoming book, The Dark Fantastic: Race and the Imagination from Harry Potter to the Hunger Games. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Thomas.
Thanks for having me.
So I will call you Ebony, but I definitely wanted to make sure that we have your title just to reflect all the education and knowledge that you'll bring to today's conversation. So as as mentioned earlier, I was definitely fascinated by the title of your upcoming book, The Dark Fantastic. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit with us how you came up with the title and sort of the inspiration for this work.
Certainly. I came up with the title many, many years ago when I first read Todorov's The Fantastic, which is a classic in the study of science fiction, fantasy, and other speculative fiction types. So he took a structuralist approach, which means that he looked at the structure of speculative fiction as a literary genre. And I thought that, I'm not really sure that he's taken into account the experiences of women, people of color, etc. And, of course, I'm not knocking him necessarily for that because of the age in which he lived. But I thought, well, if I write something about it, it's going to be the Black Fantastic or the Dark Fantastic. It's also a play off a Terry Pratchett title that's pretty famous about the Light Fantastic. And so I thought about, I remember reading that many, many years ago and thinking, again, if I write a book about this, it'll be called The Dark Fantastic because I'm a Black woman. So, yeah, okay. So that's where the title came from. I have had the title many, many years.
Very cool. So in doing some research about your educational background as well as your professional background, I know that you have a strong interest in writing about fantasy. And where did that come from? And does this book allow you to be able to? It seems like it does allow you to combine your interests with your research.
Yes, it absolutely did. It was a nice convergence. So initially, when I first went to graduate school, I thought that I would be able to write a dissertation on fantasy in the classroom. So I was intrigued by a few things that were converging throughout my 20s. The first was that I was an avid fan of Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings and other high fantasy or school fantasy novels, and a lot of my Black students in Detroit really weren't. And so I didn't think, I didn't think that they were wrong for not wanting to read the same kinds of books that their teacher did. But and it was certainly not all students. However, there seemed to be something about reading and reader identity there that I couldn't quite put my finger on. So, you had a few of the kids, nerd kids, who would openly identify with fantasy, anime, science fiction, etc. But there was also this spoken, sometimes, but often unspoken implication that fantasy and other kinds of speculative genres really weren't for Black people. And while some of that may have been because there are a few Black characters in some of the mainstream fantasy novels that have been popularized over the past half century and more, I knew something deeper was going on. So I really wanted to study that. Unfortunately, when I was in graduate school 10 to 15 years ago, almost that, I've been out 9 years, that studying fantasy in the classroom wasn't seen as a project that would be viable enough for dissertation. There wasn't much published back then that I could have drawn upon for my literature reviews. And so I had to shelve this project until I became a professor in my own right and could set my research agenda. So that's how it originated. Oh, and then there was the other thing. I tried but failed to publish my own fantasy novel. So I was a popular fan fiction author in early Harry Potter fandom, and I thought, well, I'll write my own fantasy, but I'll have Black characters in it instead. So I'll write something where my students can see themselves represented. And so I came up with this story of a teenage Black boy who's a shapeshifter, and I would read parts of it in class, and I had, copies of chapters for students to read, and I was successful getting an agent, but there was no market for that sort of thing back then. Granted, I didn't have an MFA. I wasn't wonderfully adept at craft at that time, but there are plenty of mediocre fantasies being published, but not necessarily by authors of color back then. And of course, it was in the middle of the 2000s, so this would have been 2003, 2004, and I think I stopped trying to publish that manuscript in 2007. So, my students' lack of interest, along with my inability to publish a fantasy novel, many years ago, led to me asking some questions about fantasy and the whole of speculative fiction itself. I wanted to know how it dealt with race. And that's what led to The Dark Fantastic.
Over the last year, there have been really popular fantasies. So the one that I can think of is of Blood and Bones. So I'm wondering, do you think this is a moment, or moment in time for increased inclusion, or do you think there's momentum to continue to have more books that have main characters of color and fantasy? I just want to get your thoughts.
Sure. Well, I am so thrilled by the year of the Black Girl YA Young Adult Fantasy, which was 2018. So in the same year that we got Black Panther breaking all kinds of Hollywood box office records on the big screen, we received 4 young adult novels with Black girl protagonists from the big 6 children's publishers. So there was, along with Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi, there was Dread Nation by Justina Ireland, A Blade So Black by L.L. McKinney, and Danielle Clayton's The Bells. So this was unprecedented. I think the last year that we received more than one speculative book in that category was 2013 with Alea Dawn Johnson's The Summer Prince and Sherry L. Smith's Orleans. So, at that point, we were hoping to get a few more young adult fantasy novels from major publishers. So there are a few things to be said about that. The first is that one of the arguments that I've made that's not popular is that what happens in mainstream fantasy matters as well. So looking at the ways in which characters of color are treated in narratives where the world itself, the fantasy world itself, isn't black matters, because those kinds of fantasies reach more people, at least for now. Of course, we have a Black Panther, but is that really enough to negate decades or even centuries of fantasy being pretty whitewashed? I wonder. So that's number one. The second is audience reception. Audiences loved Black Panther and Children of Blood and Bone. So these are, amazing, incredible narratives that I love and fangirl myself. However, if you look at online message boards, you look at social media and other forms of digital audience response, you often see the same old racism cropping up all over the place. And so I think, yes, we have begun some momentum. However, in the United States, as with any area where race is a factor, sometimes we'll see a glimmer of hope or progress, and we'll declare the victory as won. And I think that is just, we can't do that. When over 3,000 young adult novels are published every year, I think that 4, instead of just having 2 or 0, is a step in the right direction. But I think I'll begin to relax a little bit more when we get a couple of dozen per year. The market can handle that. The market needs that, and so do our kids and teens.
So I think maybe, do you think that some of that is because not just the fantasy genre, but I think across genres, right? There's not enough of protagonists written from the point of view of a person of color that matches the protagonist. So do you think there, in your research, and hopefully I'm hoping that you have an opportunity to also add your work as well to the fantasy and speculative fiction genre. I'm going to put that out there into the world for you.
Thank you.
Do you think there are opportunities? Hopefully, the fact that these are successful, that will help spur more, or also to maybe the process of books, because it takes so long for books to be published and put out there on the market.
Yes, absolutely. One example of that is one of my most anticipated fantasies coming up is actually a Black boy fantasy novel written by Kwame Mbalia. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. It's called Tristan Strong Punches a Hole in the Sky, and it's a middle grade fantasy novel featuring a Black boy, and the world building is based on both Black American folklore and West African myth and religion. So, and there's a prominent picture of John Henry. The cover for this is incredible, but the lead time for most of the books, it was announced, I want to say early last year, and the book won't be out until next year. So generally you have 2 or 3 years, even more lead time for many novels. But if we had a couple dozen authors in the mainstream pipeline for science fiction and fantasy, so Black authors, as well as many more authors of color and other kinds of authors from other marginalized groups, we wouldn't have to wait, so long between books. We would have a steady stream of books and content. I'm also looking at original fantasy and science fiction world building versus worlds that are already attached to an existing property. So I love Black Panther. I'm going to keep saying that. But one of the limitations of it is that it has to operate within the larger Marvel universe because Black Panther is a superhero that comes out of Marvel. Children of Blood and Bone, for instance, is not. That is her independent world building, and I'm so heartened by that. We also have an adult epic fantasy coming out this year. It's just been released this month by award-winning author Marlon James. I believe the title is Black Leopard, Red Wolf, and it's supposed to be an African Game of Thrones. So that's either, if you listen to how I'm describing these titles, usually we have to connect ourselves to an extant white fantasy or science fiction franchise. And I get it. I get why that is. I'm not saying that, we can't describe it as an African Game of Thrones, but, God bless us when we get to the time when we can just describe the story as a theme that is exciting on its own. So just describing it as, wow, this is a high fantasy novel or series or film that's based on African folklore or specific African folklore, like Children of Blood and Bone is based on Nigerian religion and mythology specifically. So I think, we're still sort of tethered to the Western fantastic, for better or for worse. And that's what my book actually looks at, race in mainstream fantasy, not analyzing what authors of color are doing, sort of a manifesto against some of the racism that continues to be embedded in mainstream fantasy and science fiction.
So I definitely want to get to that perspective that you took for the book. But I did have one quick question. I just want to get back to when you were in graduate school as well as a professor, sort of the quote unquote the nerd that, or the person who identified as a nerd that might have had an affinity for fantasy books. Do you think that is also an issue as well? Like how we subtype people, like there's this certain type of person that reads this certain type of novel?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. I think less so, and I think that's because in the millennial generation and Generation Z after them, the digital age has brought with it sort of this sense of geek chic. So it's cool to be a nerd because, you not only have social cachet associated with it, but economic success. So, 25, 30 years ago, when I was a child, being a nerd was Revenge of the Nerds and Steve Urkel from Family Matters. But now when, most of your billionaires are tech moguls, then, of course, it's cooler to be a nerd. Also, the millennial generation itself rewarded and consumed speculative fiction and created these fandoms around it. So, fandom's nothing new, but exploded with the Internet. And so millennials had these 3 big franchises that they loved. So Harry Potter, The Hunger Games, and Twilight, just to name the largest 3 that were enormously popular book series that spun off films and that are still quite profitable for both publishers and Hollywood today. That's very different than my own generation. I'm at the tail end of Generation X. Some people call our in-between generation the X-Millennials. And we rewarded realism in everything from our music, which was hip-hop and grunge, to the stories we wanted to see. Of course, we had satire like Clueless, but we certainly, after childhood, did not consume fantasy in the way that millennials have. So, the rise of that generation, which is bigger than ours, they never left fantasy. So they went from, Harry Potter and the Hunger Games all the way to Marvel, DC, and famously Game of Thrones. And, a lot of us were consuming, all of that content with them. But many people who are 40 and over, we would have never thought we'd see, everyone becoming a nerd or Comic-Con becoming such a huge thing and not something you kind of did quietly, or being able to announce that you're a Trekkie. That was grounds for getting beat up or at least socially ostracized before the early 90s. So I do think that the changes in popular culture have made the stakes of this higher than ever.
So I'm hoping that this next generation, hopefully as they become people in power, right, in terms of like heading up some of these publishing companies and become agents, right, they'll be the quote unquote the agents of change. I'm hoping, but I definitely want to get back to the perspective of the book that you've taken. In reading the title of the book and reading some background information about the book, you focus on 4 Black girl protagonists from books and TV shows. And I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about, again, why you chose to do that, to incorporate into the book, The Dark Fantastic.
So what I wanted to do was to look at how Black girls and women were being treated in very popular, financially lucrative, speculative fiction. I wanted to look at specifically transmedia narratives, which are stories that are translated from books to screen. So the term or the phrase that we use in this kind of study is from page to the screen. So these were first, in most cases, very popular books that were consumed by youth and young adults, and then they were picked up for deals. So among the 4 protagonists, Harry Potter's Hermione, and of course I race-bent Hermione just to make a point about Black Hermione, which we can get back to later. That was a film franchise. So was The Hunger Games, and I focus on Rue there. And then among television shows, which I think really have been understudied when you think about teens and diversity, what happens on the CW, ABC Family, which is now Freeform, and other television channels that are targeting not just teens, but also the young adult market, the 18 to 34 market. What happens to Black characters and other characters of color on those kinds of shows is worth note. And it's certainly something that Black audiences for these shows, Black millennial audiences notice and note. So I looked at just 2 shows. I looked at The Vampire Diaries, which I watched. It's 8 seasons long from 2009 to 2017. So I looked at teen witch Bonnie Bennett on that show. And then I looked at a race-bent Guinevere Pendragon from the BBC's Merlin. So while you can't focus on, I could have chosen some other protagonists, or not even protagonists, but Black characters, other shows, other books. I just felt as if these 4 cases were illustrative and descriptive enough that I could build the theory describing those 4. Because after a while, it gets repetitive because I kept seeing the same cycle over and over in story after story. So it's really interesting. Also, one of the things I noticed is that some of the racist violence and erasure got amplified once the narrative became visual in some cases. So, those are some of the things I noticed.
I think, and that's fascinating. I'm looking forward to reading the book once it comes out. But like you mentioned, the focus on Black Hermione, or the character Black, I shouldn't say it, right? So making Hermione black as opposed to white. And I was wondering, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, in doing some of my reading, that even in your fan fiction, you sort of envisioned her, or other people who wrote fan fiction even envisioned her as African American even before, or Black. Maybe I shouldn't say African American because she's English, right? So being Black.
Yeah, she's Black. She would be Black British, right, or mixed race British. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, first of all, one of the points I make in the book, and we'll have to get you a copy. Maybe we can see if we can scare us in advance, read her copy, if we can read it in advance, since we're on this wonderful podcast. I actually didn't see Hermione as Black. And the argument that I make in the conclusion of the book is that Black millennial girls actually read her as Black. Most people my age didn't read her as Black because we had been socialized as we learned to read that we were never the protagonist in a story like that if she were Black. So I wrote over 1 million words of fan fiction about Hermione, but I think I explained away her frizzy hair with her having a Jewish grandmother, because I had a lot of Jewish friends, and we commiserated about hair, and so that was the most I could do in my imagination. So when I saw about 10 years ago, a little less than 10 years ago, that millennial young women were on Tumblr and on other social media sites insisting that Hermione was black and drawing her as black, I was intrigued. I had no idea that my imagination had been so colonized and whitewashed through all the reading I had done ever since I was a little girl. So what I call that is an emancipatory reading. So these girls were so looking for mirrors of the self in the books that they read themselves into Hermione. They did not accept that textual erasure of the black girl. They actually read the self into Hermione. They read it. One thing that broke my heart was that Tommy said in an interview that she wrote Children of Blood and Bone because, being a Harry Potter fan growing up, she really didn't see herself represented. And I thought about my struggle and the struggle of other authors of color, particularly black women that I'm good friends with, to try to publish even mediocre or terrible genre fiction. Genre fiction back then had a reputation anyway. And my heart just breaks, because I wrote my original story, manuscript for her generation. Like, I am probably twice as old as she is. And because of that barrier in publishing, they had to read themselves into Hermione and into other fantasy protagonists who the author may not have imagined as black, but we're all the protagonists of our own stories. We're all the main characters of our own life stories, and so these girls did something incredible. They refused to accept their own erasure and marginalization in their minds.
So I'm glad that you were able to kind of sort of break that down for readers and the research that you're doing. Do you see, your career, or part of your research is on diversity in children and young adult literature. What are you seeing is on the horizon for books in general for kids of color and writers of color?
Well, I think that we're going to see more books that are either movie or television show tie-ins. We are in the golden age of television, and Marvel movies have completely dominated Hollywood. So there's never been a there's never been a better time to be a geek than now. I do hope for two things. I hope that current trends continue and that publishers and filmmakers or Hollywood executives are not flighty. So, no, not every Black fantasy movie is going to do the numbers of Black Panther. So I remember there was a lot of comparing going on when A Wrinkle of Time came out the very next month. Did do Black Panther numbers? And there were so many different reasons for that. But no, not everything is going to be a Black Panther, just like not every non-Black fantasy does Black Panther numbers. And similarly with books. Children of Blood and Bone did very well, and I believe there's going to be a movie or a film made. But I still would like to see publishers in Hollywood commit to books that are not going to be number 2 or number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list. Many fantasy and science fiction authors, particularly over on the adult side of things, they're able to build their career over years and decades. So George R.R. Martin, who is at the top of the world for Game of Thrones these days, he is a textbook example. A Song of Ice and Fire was not his first fantasy series. So that was not his first time being published. It actually happened, that huge blockbuster stratospheric success happened when he was quite middle-aged. So one of the things that many of us talk about and want to work on is, breaking more authors of color, especially Black authors in my case, since that's what I focus on, into print, but also sustaining their careers. So, perhaps if the first couple of books do okay, but they're not doing New York Times #1 bestseller numbers, let's commit to the career over time so that, hey, maybe it'll happen with their 5th or 6th novel. So I think we need to reward people who are in that game for a long time. Slow and steady wins the race, as well as the next big thing and the young ingenue. So that's what I would like to see happen in children's and young adult literature. I'd also finally like to see more editors and agents who understand fantasy and science fiction and diversity and are part of some of those conversations. Recently we had a controversy, which I won't get into, but it was over a novel written by a Chinese American woman that was a Russian fantasy, but that some early readers felt incorporated very racist tropes. And every time one of these controversies breaks and the author is pilloried and then people are saying, oh, you're being mean to the author, I always wonder why the people behind the scenes get off the hook. So with editing and gatekeeping, the function shouldn't be to keep so many people who are not like you out. It should be to make sure that you write a book that reflects the demographics of the kids we have today and that, breaks new ground instead of reincorporating so many of the bad things from the past.
Oh, man, I could talk to you for a longer period of time. I mean, I think these are important areas to address in our society. And unfortunately, our society sort of, is the fertile ground for how our children and we form as adults. So I think we do have to change the soil, right? I think, So my other hat is as a public health and pediatrician, and there's this one doc. Her name is Dr. Kamara Jones, and she does an analogy, the gardener's tale, and it's basically how you cultivate, right? How do you nourish the souls of those plants so that you don't grow up, this separate idea, but one that is inclusive. And again, I'll put a link to the Gardener's Tale. Dr. Kamora Jones does a better job of it, but I feel like there's always these intersections, right? The literature informs our culture informs our literature, and how we propagate myths, how we propagate and affirm people, and how we share our stories, and the diversity of stories is so important and integral to how we are as a society and how we'll be better as a society. So I think you're doing wonderful work, and I always am amazed at how important literature is as a parent, as a pediatrician, even public health, to help further conversations or even spark conversations and thinking and how we can progress.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I would totally agree. I do think that it's important for us to think about, anti-racism as well as decolonial narratives for children, teen, and young adults. So, I haven't figured it all out. One person I learn from all the time, among many, is Dr. Debbie Reese of American Indians in Children's Literature. So while I do a lot around race and gender in science fiction and fantasy in particular, and children's and young adult literature in general, I don't think about, sort of anti-native tropes in children's literature. And often we find that anti-Black racism and anti-indigeneity or anti-native sort of settler colonialism go hand in hand. So I've written with her before, and she's one of my close colleagues. So she's just one person. Another thing I don't often think or talk enough about is thinking about sexuality and gender creativity and nonconformity. And so I just really think that although intersectionality has been co-opted and got, by people who do not mean the rest of us very well, I really love what Professor Kimberly Crenshaw has had to say about it. We really do need to reconsider all of these, narrative positions and through the lenses that all of us have and carry with us in order to build a new and just world. And of course, as you say, stories are a huge part of that.
Thank you so much, Ebony, for joining us today.
You're very welcome. Take care.
I loved speaking with Dr. Ebony Elizabeth Thomas about her new book, The Dark Fantastic. The interview was done before the book came out, but now that the book is out, I have my copy. I'm looking forward to reading it, and I hope you pick up a copy as well. Thank you for listening to another episode of Talking About Books for Kids and supporting us. If you love this podcast, you're going to love my other podcast, What is Black? Please check that out. We're also on Apple Podcasts, where you can subscribe, rate, and review, and listen to other great interviews and episodes with authors, pediatricians, and other great guests. Talk to you soon.